Geoff is an investigative climate change journalist from Alberta, home to the Canadian tar sands. He's a frequent contributor to Guardian and Vice. His new book, The Petroleum Papers, Inside the Far-Right Conspiracy to Cover Up Climate Change, was named one of the best books of 2022 by the Washington Post, and he was a finalist for the 2022 Hillary Weston Writers Trust Prize for nonfiction. We met in a very unusual and funny way at the Climate Museum a few weeks ago, and I'll tell you the story because it's kind of funny. It was a dark and rainy night, and I was on my way to the Climate Museum, and I just eaten out with a friend, so I was really thirsty. So I see a table with refreshments and Pellegrino, one of my favorite bottles of water. So I go to get some Pellegrino, and I'm trying to open the top, and it won't open. And I see this tall blonde guy standing next to me. I figured, well, he could open it. So I tap him on the shoulder and I said, I know this sounds sexist, but would you mind opening my water bottle for me? And he says, sure. So he opens the water, pouring the water into my glass. And a minute later, the director of the museum comes by, Miranda Massey. She says, Geoff, are you ready for your interview? I'm thinking, Geoff, how could I just asked the featured speaker to open my water bottle? I was so humiliated and embarrassed. But it all worked out in the end. He's my guest. First question. Geoff, your title, Petroleum Papers, brings to mind the Pentagon Papers, which reveals lies about the Vietnam War, and also the Panama Papers, which reveal documentation about tax evasion and an offshore law firm. Were you thinking about this tradition of exposing government and corporate malfeasance when you named the book?
Yeah, to an extent, for sure. It was about a year and a half ago, my publisher and I were trying to figure out what the title of this book should be. And we were throwing around a lot of names. Much of them were very bad, and I won't repeat them now. But we were trying to give a snappy title to this giant collection of oil industry documents that I'd been relying on to write the book. And it wasn't only one collection of documents; it was several of them. So there are groups such as DSMOG and the Climate Investigation Center. They have researchers that literally go to archives in Canada and the United States. And they go through dusty old boxes and find literal documents produced by the oil and gas industry, many of them confidential, and then scan those, upload them. And so over the years, these archives have grown in size, and now there's hundreds, if not thousands of these internal documents just stored on various websites. And so in the process of writing this book, I wanted to just read all of them. I wanted to read every single document that the oil industry had produced about climate change going back to the 1950s. And I felt like that would give me sort of like a bird's eye view of how the industry had lied about climate change and covered it up. So we were trying to figure out a snappy way to refer to this resource that I was drawing from, and that's how we came up with the Petroleum Papers. And it does kind of bring to mind the Panama Papers or any other number of sort of, you know, secret accounts. And so that's why we went with it. And I think kind of the amazing thing is, like, all of this information about the oil and gas industry's lies is publicly available, and you could Google it and find it. But we wanted people to feel that sense of scandal, that sense of corporate crime, because that's what I think we're talking about here.
Thank you so much. Ironically, Geoff, I grew up in Manhattan, surrounded by buildings, but my love of nature was formed by the parks of Upper Manhattan and Central Park. You grew up in Alberta. home to the beautiful boreal forest. But you mentioned at the Climate Museum that you played inside of the tar sands. You have a room full of artists here. Can you describe to us what the tar sands even look like? It seems like a nightmare.
Well, I mean, Alberta is very beautiful, and it's like a lot of grasslands, and then the Rocky Mountains and boreal forests. I grew up in a city called Edmonton. It's about 1 million people. And it's about a 5-hour drive south of the tar sands, but there's just tons of oil and gas infrastructure in the city itself. And so when I was young, my parents would bring my brother and I to this playground that was built underneath an oil and gas refinery operated by Exxon. And so the playground was in this river valley, and the refinery was on the top of the ravine. And so we'd be like on the monkey bars, looking up and seeing these refinery stacks shooting like 30-foot flames into the air. But when you're like 6 years old, and you don't know anything else, it just seems normal. So it's only recently that I looked back on photos of that and was like, oh my God, this is such an apocalyptic scene. But I think, yeah, I tell that story to say that just, from a very early age, I was just surrounded by this stuff, like physically surrounded by oil.
Geoff, your book reads like a combination of a documentary, a mystery, a novel, and a thriller. How did you come up with the literary device of going back and forth in time, juxtaposing the personal story of Joanna, caught up in Typhoon Haiyan, and factual, hard documentary evidence of corporate misconduct in order to capture the reader's attention? I felt like I was watching a French movie from my teenage years.
Well, I think one of the challenges of writing about climate change is making it exciting and engaging to people, and telling it in the form of a narrative story. And so maybe it was 4 or 5 years ago, I can't remember exactly. I was in the Philippines covering a human rights investigation into the causes of climate change. So in the Philippines in 2013, they had this Typhoon Haiyan, which is one of the most powerful storms ever recorded on the planet. And it killed thousands of people. And it was a very traumatic event for the country. And so they were trying to figure out, how do we hold the people who we believe are accountable for this disaster? Like how do we bring, justice in some way for that? And so the Human Rights Commission there was opening an investigation into several dozen of the largest oil and gas and carbon intensive companies on the planet, including a lot of oil and gas companies that operate in the Canadian tar sands. So I just thought that was really fascinating development in the history of all of this. And so I went to the Philippines and I was covering it for Vice and a few other outlets. But then when I was there, I traveled to Tacloban City, which was sort of the epicenter of Typhoon Haiyan, and it had been like absolutely flattened, and it was like an utter humanitarian disaster when the typhoon hit. And I met this young woman. She was pretty close to my age, a bit younger, and we met up in a coffee shop that had been underwater during the typhoon. While we were drinking our coffee, she pointed to a watermark on the wall and showed me, and it was like high up. And I just couldn't believe it. And so many of her family members had been killed in the typhoon. We were just having this like very, very difficult, but also, fascinating and sort of cathartic conversation about the experience. And then she mentioned to me that in the aftermath of that disaster, that had gotten her thinking about climate change for the first time. It was never really on her mind that much before. And so she started working with some climate justice activists in the Philippines And around this same time is when there was all this new investigative reporting showing that companies like Exxon and Shell had studied climate change going back decades and then hid the findings from the public. So in some of those documents, the oil companies predicted that climate change could make tropical storms more intense and deadly. And so Joanna was learning about this, and she's like, oh my God, these companies knew that a disaster like Haiyan would result from their business model, and they covered it up and they lied about it. So for her, this was like a very radicalizing moment. And she realized like she had been victim of this sort of massive global crime. And so I wanted to set up the book in a way that sort of took readers on a similar journey to what she had experienced, going from not really thinking about climate change too much to seeing what the oil companies had learned internally about it, to learning about the cover-up and the crime, and to just sort of leave off, burning with this anger for some sort of accountability. So yeah, I think that's a long answer to your question.
It was really effective. I mean, I couldn't put your book down. It really grabbed me. It was really thought-provoking. There are many shocking revelations in the book, but perhaps the most shocking comes at the beginning. What was atomic physicist Edward Teller doing at an American Petroleum Institute conference in 1959, celebrating 100 years of business held at Columbia? Teller said at the conference, he was a keynote speaker, quote, "A 10% increase in CO2 will melt the ice caps and submerge New York." Now, the CEOs of all the oil majors were at this conference because it was a big celebration. So my question is, we thought that Exxon knew in the 1970s. Are you telling us the entire oil industry knew in 1959?
Yes. And so when I was going through all the documents that I could get my hands on about what the oil industry has known about climate change, I was trying to find the earliest possible date where you could credibly say, yes, the industry knew about the dangers of climate change at this time. And I think what you're describing is possibly one of the earliest warnings that industry leaders received about climate change. And it's kind of incredible that it happened so many years ago in New York City. And the guy who gave the warning, Edward Teller, I mean, he wasn't any sort of environmentalist or anything like that, like he'd helped invent the atomic bomb. But there's sort of a fascinating history there, because the US government, after they had realized the destructive potential of these weapons, they began devoting all of this time to studying what the impact of nuclear war might do to weather systems. And it was through that research, actually, that the term environmental sciences was created. And so they were some of the earliest government researchers to sort of begin to understand the greenhouse gas effect, and then later the role that oil and gas plays in leading to climate change. So you have this government scientist who invented one of the most powerful weapons on the planet, warning many oil and gas leaders that their business model could be more destructive to the planet than nuclear war. It's in 1959, and like, what did they all do with this information? They buried it for the most part. And in fact, one of the executives who was sitting next to Edward Teller on stage at Columbia, his name was Robert Dunlop. He was the head of a company called Sun Oil. 4 years after this event, Robert Dunlop was up in northern Alberta, near where I grew up, and his company was helping set up the Canadian tar sands, which were believed to hold more oil than in all of Texas. So, I mean, they, like the speakers, like like Bill McKibben and James Hansen were saying earlier, the companies did this with eyes open. They fully knew the impacts of these decisions that they were making, even way back in the 50s.
It's so disturbing. Geoff, you were able to obtain emails from some very nefarious characters. The story of the oil and gas consultant Michael Watley and the Canadian diplomat Gary Moore sounds like a plot from Dante's Inferno. We all wondered why Obama administration got so little done for the climate, and this chapter really tells us why. California had passed a low carbon fuel standard in 2008, and 11 states had already filed a letter of memorandum to go along to do the same thing in their states. And this guy Watley, who represented the oil industry, gets together with this guy, Gary Moore, from the diplomatic mission from Alberta in Washington, D.C. And the question is, it's amazing that you got all of their emails and you're able to see what was going on between the two of them, because actually they derailed the entire thing. 11 states were about to pass a low carbon fuel standard, and these two people actually forced the states not to, and to keep dependent on tar sands oil. I mean, the whole thing is, it's an unbelievable, you wouldn't believe it was true unless you read about it. How did you get their emails, Geoff?
Well, I've only, so as journalists sometimes get their hands on documents like this by filing Freedom of Information requests, or I think it's called access to information in the US. Or I might have that backwards. Anyway, I've only done really one of these in my entire life, and it really paid off because I decided to ask for all the emails that had been exchanged by this person in the Canadian embassy and a guy I knew to be a very prominent oil industry lobbyist. And I filed the request, and then 6 months later, I got this envelope full of 300 pages of their personal emails. And I was just like, oh my God, wow, I can't believe they gave this to me. And so I started going through all the emails, and the story in them really is quite incredible, because it shows how top diplomats in the Canadian government actively worked with all of the big oil companies in the United States to really sort of blunt and weaken Obama's climate change ambitions. And specifically what they were after were any type of policy that would shrink the market for Canadian tar sands, which is still the biggest source of foreign oil to the United States. And I don't mean to say that this is like these two people are the only ones doing this type of stuff, because there are just tons and tons of efforts like this. But I thought it was so revealing just to hear the players discuss it privately amongst themselves, because they're very cynical in how they frame all of this. And the whole campaign was based around creating the impression that there were thousands or hundreds of thousands of Americans who really care about keeping the tar sands coming into the US. But in fact, this was all sort of, fabricated. And they lay out the strategy very clearly in these emails. And so I think this is just like, a small glimpse for us in the public to see how industry operates behind the scenes. And in the case of what Obama was trying to do, it was quite effective back then.
That kind of feeds into my next question, because the American Petroleum Institute not only studied this problem with their own scientists connecting the burning of fossil fuels and the rising temperature, they actually hired Stanford's scientists to weigh in, and Stanford verified everything that their own people were saying. A guy named James Black, is that it? Actually wrote to the president of Exxon to say, the window is shrinking. We have 5 to 10 years before the impacts of this burning of fossil fuels will really affect the ecosystems. So the question is, at what point in the writing of your book did you reflect on the sheer criminal indifference to the use of their product by these CEOs, and did it affect you emotionally?
I guess I kind of knew the basic outlines of this story, but the deeper and deeper I went into it, I felt myself getting angrier and angrier. But it was kind of it was kind of like a clarifying anger to an extent, because once you read through all of the primary documents that companies like Exxon are producing or have produced about climate change, see the warnings that executives are receiving, and then read about the development of campaigns to lie about the science to the public. It's upsetting stuff to read, but it also sort of like it had kind of like a calming effect on me too, emotionally, because I was like, here it is, like this is the actual story of why we haven't done the stuff we need to on climate change. And there are, you can put names to the people who sabotage our opportunities. The companies are very recognizable. So I guess I had felt for a while like climate change was kind of this mystery, or there was like some flaw in human nature that prevented us from doing something about it. And by the time I was done the book, I've become convinced really that it's just a small amount of companies and executives who've derailed many of our best opportunities to solve this thing. And I think we fully could solve it as a society, but we need some way to hold these companies accountable and really check their political and economic power. So that's kind of the arc that I went through.
That's very interesting that the more you found out, the more at peace you became with this horrible situation. There are some groups that sound so benign in the Global Climate Coalition. Sounds like a concerned environmental group. The National Association of Manufacturers sounds like a place that makes washing machines and vacuum cleaners. Who are these people really?
Well, the National Association of Manufacturers is pretty interesting because they're one of the big trade groups in Washington, and they represent all sorts of big companies. And there was actually a point in the 90s when this association was helping tobacco companies come up with strategies for downplaying fears about cancer related to smoking. And at the same time, the association was helping oil companies come up with strategies to downplay public fears about climate change. And so these two denial strategies were at one point linked up and operating at the same time and being run by the same people. But as we got into the later part of the 90s, the Global Climate Coalition was sort of the main vehicle for spreading disinformation about climate change, and it was set up by all the major oil and gas companies, along with some pretty far right political organizations like Grover Norquist's Americans for Tax Reform, and this group, the Climate Coalition, you really just can't understate the impact they had on the politics of all of this stuff. Because when in the years after James Hansen gave his original testimony to Congress about climate change in 1988, there were huge majorities of the public and countries around the world who were really concerned about this. And by the end of the 90s, less than half of Americans at one point even believed that climate change was real. It's just like a dramatic shift in opinion. And then when the George W. Bush White House fully decided that it wasn't going to have anything to do with the Kyoto Protocol, there was a cable released from the government acknowledging that the Global Climate Coalition was responsible for the government's thinking. So they were incredibly powerful, and they had a huge impact.
We think of Canada as our friendly neighbor to the north with good health care and great cheap pharmaceuticals. And yet in your book, Justin Trudeau comes across as somewhat villainous. For example, he implies that it's better not to deny climate change because it will sell more pipelines. He says to the Calgary Petroleum Club, if we had a stronger environmental policy in this country, then I believe Keystone XL pipeline would have been approved already. He then went on to sign off on the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, allowing 600,000 additional barrels of tar sands to flow. How did we get Justin Trudeau so wrong? Why do we think he's such a great environmentalist?
There's kind of two Trudeaus. There's the Trudeau that people around the world know, sort of this like environmental leader, and he was welcoming Syrian immigrants at the airport in Toronto at the same time that Trump was doing his Muslim ban. So all that stuff sort of plays well to international audiences. But in Canada, Trudeau is not really regarded as progressive at all by most people who are involved in the climate movement or care about these things. And I think, if Trudeau were a Democrat, he'd be sort of, like a centrist, almost right-leaning Democrat with campaign contributions contributed by oil and gas companies. So I think he's cultivated an effective global image. But in Canada itself, he's sort of led the creation of this like friendlier face for the oil and gas industry. So, the big companies in Canada now, all of their talk is about how they're partners in the climate fight. They need to be at the table. They're an essential part of the solution. And it was really Trudeau who helped them come up with that strategy. And the thing that I found most revealing was that right after Trump was elected, Trudeau did all of this, all of these press conferences and sent out tweets and whatever, sort of condemning the Trump administration and its climate denial and whatever. But then there were internal cables produced by the Canadian government, which were quietly celebrating the election of Trump because it was viewed as an administration that would be very friendly towards Canadian oil. And so those were reported in The Guardian a few years ago.
Our last question for Geoff, and we'll open up for questions. Recently, 16 Puerto Rican towns filed a lawsuit in federal court against Exxon, Chevron, and others for environmental damage from our warming climate. The basis for the lawsuit was a fraudulent marketing scheme to convince the public that oil and gas don't harm the climate, contrary to what their own studies were revealing. This deception violates U.S. racketeering law. Do you think this lawsuit stands a good chance of succeeding? Is there more evidence available now than it was previously about the oil majors?
I mean, we'll see what happens with these lawsuits. They're pretty interesting, though. There's more than 20 of them in the U.S. right now, and they more or less make the same argument, which is that leading oil companies deliberately misled the public about climate change and sort of sabotaged our best solutions. And now places like Puerto Rico are having to deal with the costly impacts of that. There hasn't been any successful climate lawsuit yet, and I'm not sure what it would take to sort of push one over the edge. But it's worth remembering the history of tobacco. And a lot of these lawsuits are, deliberately referencing those tobacco lawsuits. And in some cases, the same lawyers are working on them. Tobacco is considered, a totally, an industry so powerful that it was seen as like foolish or financially irresponsible for law firms to go after the tobacco companies in the 90s, because no one had ever won against them. And then of course, the industry faced one of the biggest corporate settlements in human history after its executives acknowledged that they knew about the links between smoking and cancer. And so I think that's what a lot of these lawsuits now in the US are aiming at. And the Puerto Rican one is just the latest example. And I guess we'll just see what happens with that.
Thank you, Geoff.